Welcome back. In today's episode, we get the tops made for our workbench and get it all assembled and back together. I'll take you through the process and show you it's not that hard. Okay, welcome back to the second day. I've had a good look at it overnight and made a few modifications, so I'll take you through that now, then we'll get started with the work. Firstly, you'll notice I've lifted this top rail up to the top of the frame, so it's on the top slot. It makes it a little bit tricky because it does sit proud here, so we're going to have to do some packing and whatnot to get this frame to sit on, but it looked a little bit weird from underneath because the rail sat down here with a gap underneath this timber portion. So it's a lot neater and a lot more tightly packaged up the top. And you'll note I've also turned these shelf supports on their side, and there's already a hole in the side of these shelf supports which actually lines up with the fixing hole from underneath on the side rail. So what I've done is I've tapped that hole to accept an M6 bolt, and I've actually bolted it from underneath. Now what this is going to do is these two supports will allow me to sit my extension down into this area underneath the worktops. So the challenge now is to separate these legs and the side rails from the existing table, which are doweled together. Separate them off, and then we need to start shortening and adjusting the existing table frame to sit tightly onto our new metal frame base. Now these side rails on the table are 65mm high, but they're actually a little bit too short because of the notching for the leg that comes through for the table. So what I do have is 65mm pre-primed timber, which I'll chop down, and I'll use that for the new side rails for the timber frame support. Now, while this looks a little bit crazy, I do use quite often this Rust-Oleum hammered paint. It's fantastic because it's got a proper trigger to spray with and finishes to match a lot of the other accessories you have in your shed. Now this paint on the timber work will finish in a lot better with the black framing of the shelf unit. It's not a 100% match, but it'll blend it all together and make it look quite tidy. Now that we've got this set and we've got a plan of attack, it's time to take this frame off, move the mobile one to the side and start knocking it apart. Okay, now we've got our two long ends left over from the table. You'll also notice I've chiseled off a little bit of the remnants of the old diagonal brace that were on there, just to tidy it up a little bit. Eventually I'll go through and buzz all this off, so it's not a big drama, it's just to make it easier to work with. What we're going to do now is chop off the legs from each side. Noting that there's dowels in here, I want to make sure I can just chop them to get a nice square edge. If the dowels do protrude in a little bit, it won't be a big drama. And that'll give us a starting point to measure across and get the right length for the other end, so we start boxing this back in and get it ready to go into the new frame. So we've got our two sides from the old table cut down. these are the ones with the slots in them that the extrusions run through, so the extending sides. You'll notice that you can just see the dowels in here, but I think that's quite nice. So what I'll do now is I'll sand and finish these off, and then I'm going to mark and pilot drill the holes to screw these onto the new side pieces. And then from there, it's getting these long clamps, clamping it all together, make sure it's square. Our surrounds all bolted together, and I've now done the trial fit onto the base of the unit. Fits fairly well. It's very, very snug, just again due to a few of the sort of intolerances in the frame itself, but I'd rather it be snug than loose and flopping around. I've made up some packers. Now these were very close to fitting in. I've just had to file them or sand them down slightly so that they fill the gap down the side between the metal frame and the timber frame. And what I will do is pack them down into the frame and then screw from the inside through and into the outer timber frame all the way around the perimeter to keep it all nice and tight. I've also temporarily put some screws in to the ends. That's just to get it sitting all nice and level. And I've also put a level over it to make sure it is sitting true and flush, and it is also sitting square. Well, what I will end up doing is taking these screws out once it's painted and putting some bolts through on either end. Now it's just a case of pulling the top off, sand it down, we'll give it a spray and put it all back together in the morning. And just like that, the top's on and it's all one piece now. You'll notice I upgraded the small screws into some nice M8 bolts with nylocks on them, so that'll hold it on a lot better. Also fixed in our packing onto the side and fastened these side rails onto the steel rails, and it came out looking pretty good. So now we're going to start working on the tops for our workbench. I've bought a 1200 by 1800 sheet of form ply. So I'll take that out and run you through what we're going to do. But essentially it's working with those modules and the existing table leaves to see what we can come up with to make these tops. Now I was pretty happy with the size of the leaves that were on the table originally. It's just the fact that they had those curved ends on them that made it a little bit hard to use, as you can't clamp anything onto a right angle corner or anything like that. In some cases, it did actually work to my advantage, because if you're working different materials, you do have that curve that you can sort of sit things on and sand around and stuff like that. But ideally, you want a nice squared off edge. If you break the 1800 length down, what we can do is do 2 large leaves, which are 700 deep, which is pretty much the size of the original table leaves that went on here, by 1000 wide. And what I'll do is I'll chop 100 mil off both sides, which gets rid of the grey finish that you get on the normal form ply, the sealer they have around the outside. And what I'll do with the 100 mil is I'll use that as the thickening that goes down either side and along the ends of the bench to make a double width on that side. So if I do 2 700 lengths, I end up with a 400 mil wide strip left over. Now I've also got another 400 mil wide strip, so then I can actually make 2 400 wide leaves, which will sit down in here on our table underneath the working surface to be pulled out. A future project that I've been looking at is whether or not, particularly with one of those legs, I put some slots in so you can get some clamps up through it, or put some holes in so you can use the dogs that a lot of people that do woodwork use. So that gives the opportunity that I can keep the large leaves pretty much free and nice and neat, and then I can have some other work surfaces that click in through the middle for any special projects that you might want to do. So we'll go out, we'll put the plywood down, and we'll start looking at sectioning it up and slicing it down. Okay, so here's our sheet of form ply, 17 mil thick, and being form ply, it's a structural F17 grade board, which means it's fairly strong, even though it's reasonably thin. The idea is to cut a 100 mil wide strip off either side, which I can then flip, and then I'll have the cut edge on the outside, and that gives me a 1000 deep surface that'll work perfectly as the main bench width to go onto our workbench. Now when you come to cut these large sheets down, I do actually have a Trident work centre where you can rip timber through in a desired width and stuff like that. But I do find with large boards like this, even when you have 2 people, it's very hard to pull through in a straightforward motion without having a little bit of a wiggle in it, which invariably does a crooked cut. So I always tend to, with these large sheets, to cut them down with a circular saw by hand. And at the end of the day, you also want to try to get this large sheet down into a manageable size, so you're not doing great big long cuts and stuff like that. So to start off with, what we're going to do is, on this sheet, we will cut our 400 mil middle section off first. So that'll shorten the overall length of the sheet. And then we can cut our 100 mil off the remaining 1400 long sheet. Now I say that because I've got another 400 deep offcut from a previous project when I did the fit out on my van, and I'll use that as a straight edge or a guide to run the saw along. It's a little bit too short to do the full 1800, but it should be fine for the 1400. So that's a way of getting around that. It's also long enough to do this first 400 as well. So we'll get the middle section cut out of it. That can go with the offcut, and then we'll shorten them down as we need to as part of the process. And then we'll do our 2 700 mil leaves, but because we're slicing down either side while they're in one 1400 long piece, it'll mean they're nice and flush from side to side when you go to assemble the final table. And that'll keep it all nice and neat. While you can sand it down, you do know that there's not going to be 1 or 2 mil variance where you've set the saw slightly wrong or something like that. It'll be equal on both sides because the 1400 long length will be then cut through the middle to give our 2 700 mil long leaves. Okay, we're ready to make our first cut. With your circular saw, adjust it so your blade's just hanging down. You don't want it hanging all the way down or halfway through the saw. 1, it doesn't cut very good, and 2, it's quite dangerous. So you don't want it hanging down too far, and that'll make sure you don't cut through anything else underneath as well. another thing I always do is I normally cut with this edge here on the saw running along the guide. I find it quite easy because when you mark your lengths, you just add another 3 centimeters onto it, so there's no real calculating or thinking about, you know, little allowing for the blade width and the kerf cut and all that sort of stuff. It just makes it nice and easy. And also, if you do have clamps down, the motor's not running past and hitting things like our clamps here, because I can use my normal straight edge on this length. If you've got a large piece of timber you're using as a straight edge, this isn't such an issue, but when you're using something fairly narrow, you don't want to get halfway through your cut and find you've got to stop because the motor's hitting on what you've used to clamp it down. And again, always wear your safety gear. So wear your muffs and your eye protection, and take care when you're doing this sort of stuff. And the last thing to note is also that the saw will cut a lot cleaner on one side than the other. So take note of the surface that you're cutting and always cut on that same side. So you'll always have a nice clean finish on one side and a slightly chipped surface on the other. If you take note and try not to flip things over too many times, you'll end up with one surface with a nice clean cut on it. That's good enough to be used as the finishing side of your project. So I've just put the 2 main leaves roughly on the bench just to get an idea of how it's going to look and how the height's going to work. And I do have to say there's probably going to be a change of plans here because it's just a little bit too high, which is what we've sort of been wondering all along. Putting the casters onto the 900mm unit probably does make it a little bit too high. I've been trying to work out how I'm going to do that. So I think what I'm going to do is cut it down the equivalent of 1 slot and then reassemble it all back together, and that'll bring the height down probably a good 80 or 90mm, which will be a lot better. So what I've done here is I've measured down 76mm, and so it makes it easier to see when I'm cutting. I've wrapped the tape around. That's a nice quick and easy trick on a dark contrasting material where you can't see your mark. Wrap a bit of tape around. That gives you a bit of a cutting guide for when you go around and get it all nice and neat. So now we'll go through, we'll cut the tops off here and bring the table down. So in preparing for the new tops, I flipped the old tops back over and started doing a little bit of measuring to work out how the underside of the new tops is going to work. So the sides I've done as 100mm on my new tops, the thickening I'm putting down the side, it actually lines up perfectly with this outside aluminium extrusion. So the 100mm thickening fits in through here, and then I'll show you on the other one. What I've done is then measured back, and you'll see on the table there's a stop just here, and that's to stop the top sliding past the middle point of the table. So then I've measured back out and I've increased the thickening on the end of the new benches to align with that, which in my case worked out to be around about 125mm in. Because what you want to do is transfer all of this to the underside of the new tabletops, or to the new bench tops. So coming over to the new tops, I've got one side that I've assembled and one side I'm partway through assembling, just so I can show you a bit of the process. So how I'm going to attach the thickening onto the underside of the tops is I'm using some contact adhesive to bond, and then I'm screw fixing in as well. So that provides two sources of adhesion and should keep it very stiff and firm. So on this side, you see that's already happened. So I've screwed at centers, and I've also used a contact adhesive to bond these two layers together, rather than a PVA glue, because of the film or the surface of the plywood. The PVA's got nothing to soak into, and it won't work quite as well. I'm not really a fan of liquid nails, so I think the contact adhesive, it will work quite well. It's almost like bonding a laminate panel to some plywood or a substrate of that sort. So what I've done is I've just quickly buzzed the surfaces that I want to bond to try to scuff a bit of that release agent off and provide a bit of a rougher surface texture for the contact adhesive to bond onto. I'm then applying it and actually bonding it together while it's still slightly wet or hasn't fully cured, so I can still move these around and get them right, because you want to line up the edges as well as you can to get it all sitting nice and neat. So we've got our main tabletops done and ready to go on. I've also put on the outside rails so that this leaf can slide in, and we'll do a bit of a test to make sure that works. I have been playing around a little bit. It is reasonably tight to slide in, so I've actually had to run the saw down along this edge on both sides and just shift it across a little bit. It's just a little bit tight. But before we put it together, one thing we need to address is how these two leaves and the insertion leaves will all lock together. The existing table has a series of pressed-in receivers and studs that go into there to lock all the leaves together. The one issue with this is that when you're working on the table, it does have a tendency to pull apart. So what I'm planning on doing here is using these over center fasteners. So they'll lock and clamp the two work surfaces together. And then if we've got extra leaves, the same thing, they'll lock and clamp all the other leaves together as well. Now, noting that we'll have additional leaves which will go on to the receivers, I thought the best way to do this, to save measuring and getting things slightly wrong, so what I've done is I've made up a jig template, and it's got the holes for the fasteners. And what we will do, move them out of the road, is actually place that on each piece, and it's centered. The marks are actually centered, so I can have it on the opposite side as well. And all you do is you just line up one line with the leaf, clamp it down, and then we can drill down and get the holes perfect on each of the pieces that we do. And obviously this can then be transferred onto the other leaves which will go in, and any additional leaves, so that we know when it comes to put the additional leaves in and fasten them together, technically they should lip over each other. Again, fingers crossed, let's see what happens. Now the other thing I've been addressing is, this all needs to be finished through here, so don't worry about the chipping, but again, this is why when we were cutting these boards up, said it's important to always cut from one surface, because you'll always end up with a a good surface and a bad surface as far as the kerf of the saw goes. So this side's all chipped, which is the underside. But anyway, that's another point. That's just an example of what sort of happens there. I will go through and finish that off a little bit better. But getting back to the point. So what I'm looking at is through the center of the leaf, there is a potential for them to be slightly uneven. So you want them to lock together. Now, instead of putting the pins in and the whole process that goes with that, because we're obviously not a machine shop, and trying to get it accurate so the pins in different leaves all bolt together and lock, I've come up with the idea of using some aluminium flat bar I've got lying around. So it will be screwed into position here on the outside leaves. And then what I'm doing is I'm just doubling over another 2 pieces as a receiver so that it'll slide in and lock together. So the leaves that get inserted in will always be set up so that you have this on the left-hand side of the leaf and this on the right-hand side of the leaf. So again, they just keep slotting into each other as you add new leaves in. I really think this is probably the easiest and most foolproof solution. So anyway, we'll get stuck into this now, get all this assembled, and then we'll do a trial run of inserting the leaves and making sure it all works. Fingers crossed. It does work this time, now that we've done the shaving down. It did go together. It's just that the leaf that I tried to put in with the outside rails on it was just really, really tight. And it might also be a case that we painted the timber here and that binds up a little bit with the aluminium going through. I haven't got any silicone spray here. I did check around and I don't want to use WD-40. So I might spray with something just to see if I can lubricate it up a little bit, just to make it easier to slide in and out. Okay, so now we're going to have a go at taking this leaf on this side out, sliding it in, and then we'll reposition the other one over the top, clamp it together, and then look to get the inside guide done for this leaf as well. Fingers crossed, it all goes to plan. As I said, I'm going to pull this off, give it a quick spray of some lubricant. That should help it slide within the guides of the rails underneath, and we'll see how we go. Oh yes, heaps better. Look at that. That is so much better than what it was. Okay, so I'm happy with that. This one works. I'll now dummy fit the other one underneath. Or over the top. And then we can get our rails in. Now I'm trying hard with this, not to be too hard with the plywood and dropping it on the ground so that we chip corners off and stuff like that. But ultimately, this goes in here, push this in a little bit further. There we go, locks together all nicely. Okay, now we've got all our bench top done. I just want to go around with a router or a trimmer and just lightly bevel the edges off. I don't want to put a huge crappy pencil round or anything on it, but at the same time it's quite sharp how it's been cut, and it will invariably nick and damage over time. So it's just a case of running the router around just to give us very, very slight soft bevel to all the finished sharp edges, and then I'll quickly buzz around with the palm orbital sander just to get it all nice and smooth. And here it is, the finished product. Still needs a little bit of tweaking here and there, but this is essentially the completed, fully extended mobile workbench. I'll give you a quick walk around and show you what it's all about. Okay, here it is. The full table with the 2 leaves that I've made so far to fit in. I haven't really done too much in the way of accessories or anything like that. It's more just to get this table finished so we can move on to other projects. I do need to put the vise back in. I'm just trying to work out at the moment, do I put it in one of these leaves so then I can put it away or move it somewhere else? But I probably will put it back on one of the main leaves, I think. And if I need to pull it out, I need to pull it out. So, but man, that's an awesome table. I mean, you really could use it for almost anything, really. You notice I ended up routing the edges in between the leaves. It's just made it a lot neater. This panel here is from an old lot of plywood I had lying around, so it's slightly discoloured compared to the rest, but again, it'd be pretty rare that you'd have all 4 leaves in use, and you'd usually have them covered anyway. So there you go. There's the finished table. I'll collapse it away now and we'll have a quick discussion on it. So there you have it. Here's our finished workbench. It's extremely mobile and easy to move around. It really is. I think it's really going to do a good job. It's much better than the old table we were using. It's got a nice, decent height to work at. It's not too high now that we've cut it down, and it's definitely not too low. Yep, easy to move around. Then you just pop the brakes on when you want it stationary, and it's dead simple to delatch and open up. It's just the perfect solution to having an adaptable workbench within your shed or garage area. Now there are some fine tuning things to do, obviously. What I probably will do is these aluminium slots that go in, I'm going to round them off a little bit more so it slides together a little bit easier, and it just needs a little bit of adjusting and tweaking here and there. But again, it's not a factory built item. This is something we've just built in our shed. So it's always going to have a little bit of tolerance here and there. But I think as far as a nice practical workbench, it's going to be fine. Now, these tops, I'm going to say are sacrificial. Form ply is extremely cheap to buy. It's reasonably resilient, but I do find it does mark and dent a little bit if you're working on really heavy stuff. So I'll probably do a combination of just using it as it is. I mean, at the end of the day, it's a workbench. It will get a hard life and get nicks and marks, and that tells a bit of a story of all the projects you've done. But I probably will buy, firstly, some self-healing cutting mats that you might get from a craft shop or anything like that. They've got a bit of a grid and everything on them. They're really, really good to work with. Also use poly chopping boards as well. It's just so you're not carving and cutting into your top. And for really heavy duty stuff that we'll be doing, I probably will have a sheet of masonite lying around and you just lay on top. And you don't completely trash it, then you can throw things down and whatnot. And then, as I said, you've got these other leaves which we can adapt and modify and evolve to suit what we're doing. But essentially, we've reused the guides. Probably not much else really, but it's the general concept of taking that dining table and how it operates, the ease of how it operates, and adapting it to be a multi-function accessory for your garage or shed. So I hope you enjoyed watching this. Hey, put your thinking cap on, have a go, build something yourself. This has cost us maybe $200, maybe $250 by the time you add in a bit of hardware and stuff like that, and a few days of our time. It really is a very cheap workbench. And if you went to go and buy something like this, I mean, what are you going to be paying? It would be a lot more, probably double the price. So it's definitely something that I will get a lot of use out of. If you wanted to go and do the same, you're more than welcome to take some of the ideas and evolve it even further. There's a lot of things on here I probably would do slightly differently again, but again, you're sort of just building on the run, so you're learning as you go. If I did build a version 2, I would change a few things. Look, is this base the best thing to use now that I've had to chop it down? I'm not quite sure. And to be honest, you know, do you need to use a dining room table? Probably not. Now that we've seen how it all works, you could probably buy some aluminium extrusions and do something similar yourself, just using off-the-shelf products rather than having to scrap a whole table, seeing as though we couldn't actually recycle much of it at all. So, but it's just a general idea, and the fun concept of saying, well, we're taking our dining room table and turning it into an extendable and multifunction workbench. So that concludes this episode. There'll be a few other episodes that go into the series as we grow and adapt this table. I do want to build a few different inserts that go into here. So I'll do another episode in the future, which is looking at how we go about doing that and other accessories and things you can do with these tables. I hope you enjoyed the build series. Please like, subscribe and share around. Put some comments down if you enjoyed this, or you got some ideas, or you think I've done something silly. Put them down, I'll respond to them. And most of all, get out there and stay safe. Thanks for watching.